All right, friends, we'll get started. All right, there's a little lag on comments coming through, but thanks, Corinne. I see a yes. So it's lovely to have you all here this morning. Welcome. This is a little bit interesting because I think folks would think that I would just begin by talking about objectives and key results, since objectives and key results are what I live and breathe these days. But I wanted to mix it up a little bit and talk about one of the cases for objectives and key results in our organization, and that is using goal setting as a way to help us architect change. So, we'll do a little bit of kind of information sharing with you this morning. And then it's not a long set of prepared material, but I did want to do a little bit of knowledge transfer. Everyone who's here will get both a link to a recording of this and also a set of the materials that we go through today. And in addition to what I am sharing on this change topic, I'm also including some of my money slides about OKR practice, words, meanings, some simple tools in that handout that I'm going to send you after this if you're interested. So we'll begin with a little bit of a chat about change and the case for change, how goal setting can help us make and achieve our case for change. And then I'm going to open it up to an AMA. And that AMA portion can be on the change topics that we discuss, but that's also if you have objectives and key results or leading for goal achievement questions, that's really an open floor for that AMA. So pre-think your questions. There is a little bit of a lag on the comments coming through for me to see them. So we might take just a beat between the prepared part and the AMA so that I can see your questions come through. I don't want to have any not get to my end. So also feel free to drop questions in the chat window as we go, and I will address questions either as we go or when I can. But really, I just want to say thank you all for being here. This is my first time live on LinkedIn, and I'm nervous and excited. And it was really lovely to see so many familiar names in the RSVP list. So thanks for joining today. We are, as you know, here to talk about architecting change and how we can rethink goal setting to achieve the change that we see possible in our organizations and in our work. And the purpose of this conversation is to partly acknowledge that change is really hard for people, for organizations. There's a book called Immunity to Change that follows the research on how challenging change is for people. One of the big research points that they cite is that even in matters of life and death, when we know or when we are told by medical professionals that we must make changes as a matter of life and death, people still have a hard time making change. So we want to acknowledge that change is really hard. And what we're going to talk about today helps us shift how we think about goal setting from a win-loss model or a win-loss mechanism to a win-learn model. And that can help organizations increase their change impact. I'm also going to share a little thinking trick with you all because by virtue of you being here, I presume that you are change makers. It's not folks who are averse to change that would have RSVP'd yes for this particular live session. So I have a little pro tip for you as change makers on how to increase your change effectiveness or your effectiveness at bringing others along in the context of change being difficult. So this is for change maker leaders. When I say strategic operators, that means all the PMs, so project managers, program managers, product managers, chiefs of staff also, and then also folks who are in operational roles who are hands-on around goal setting and change work. And then the other people that we talk to here at Red Current Collective and Thinky Doers are Thinky Doers. So individuals who tend to be strategic thinkers who may struggle with frustration in their work. Sometimes, as thinky doers, as strategic brains, we can be the only in our organizations or have an orientation that's different from most of the other folks who are wired for implementation or execution. And so we do create space for thinky doers to connect with each other, learn from each other, and ultimately, I hope to see thinky doers come together to change the world for the better. So I presume you are in one of those buckets since you're here on this call today. And I am our host. I'm Sarah Lobkovich. I'm the founder and principal consultant at Red Current Collective. And then I put in a little asterisk there. I'm also the co-owner of Counterweight Motorsports and C-Dub Moto Racing. So when I'm not doing this work around career and organizational peak performance, I co-own and operate a professional U.S. National motorcycle road racing team. That's where I learn everything I need to know about peak performance, and then I just borrow from that work when I'm here at my desk. So that's what we're going to work on today. That's what we're going to do together. This I'm not going to read for you, but I'm going to include in the materials that we send as follow-up. What we do at Red Current Collective is OKR coaching and consulting specifically for organizations focused on measurably improving outcomes. That's our specialty here, making OKRs work better for organizations. We also do a lot of learning and development work for changemaker leaders and thinky doer teams. A lot of our leader development is focused on people who may not have kind of had the easy pathway into leadership, people who might have been essential number twos, making the move into a P1 role. We work with a lot of folks who are going from from that kind of senior leadership level into the C-suite or moving through the layers of leadership. And what they find is that what got them there won't get them there. What got us here won't get us there. And so a lot of our learning and development is focused on helping people leaders build consistent toolkits for leadership that they can carry with them through their entire career. And then bringing together, as I said, community for folks who fit those criteria. So executive coaching and community connection for strategic operators and thinky doers. But let's get into the meat of why we're here. This topic of how do we architect and successfully achieve change is always relevant, but we are working and existing in a market right now where the volatility is bananas. The only constant is change in the operating environment. And sometimes that can lead organizations to kind of hunker down in terms of internal change. But I see phases like this as a chance for us to really examine the status quo and see where we must make change. Where can we eliminate risk in a volatile operating environment by embracing opportunities to change? Performance pressure right now is really high. Results are really critical in a down market like this. And so again, this is a case for re-examining our business as usual and then making necessary changes so we can really focus on driving results and not necessarily on kind of just executing business as usual. There's also increased pressure, ever since the beginning of the pandemic, on organizational purpose and employee engagement. So on that question of how does my work connect to what's most important, or how does my purpose and how does my work matter? Those questions remain really top of mind. There's some great research on the impact that those questions play on retention and satisfaction and engagement in our work. And so the Acknowledging change and creating pathways to change are one of the ways, two of the ways that we can help increase employee engagement with those questions and also employee sat around critical issues that do need to change and evolve. We don't want to lose our high performers because we're resistant to change. We don't want to lose our high potentials because the organization is resistant to change. And what gets in the way of change, you all know this as well as I do, change is hard. As I said, we have that immunity to change as human beings. Even those of us who are wired for change, we're still overcoming a lot of programming to have that orientation. Change feels risky, but what we acknowledge in, especially in market conditions like this, is that the status quo is really risky too. So we need to be eyes open about the relative risk of maintaining the status quo and embracing change that needs to happen. And then there is just an uphill battle in a lot of organizations around organizational alignment and the internal appetite for change. So this is a lot of information on one slide, but I'm going to again send it to you as as an after read. These are the myths that I hear most commonly about goal setting for change. And the one most common that I hear so frequently is we can only set goals we can control. The model that I work with objectives and key results, is based on setting goals around things that we might not control. We have to think beyond what we can control in order to actually change things. So, courageously and creatively setting goals that we influence, even if we don't actually control them, allows us to actually make change. When we set goals within our control, that leads to an over-focus on activities because we feel like we can control what we do every day, even if we don't feel like we can control the outcomes we're working toward or achieving. And then it also tends to lead to really siloed or individualistic thinking because when we have to think together or when we're thinking about collaborating, we are giving up some of our control. And so this is a really big myth. When we are working to change, we need to think about setting goals that we may influence, not only control. And so then our organizational operating systems need to create safety for us to try and fail on our goals, on those goals that are able to be tried and failed on in the pursuit of progress or learning. I also often hear from it comes up a lot among senior leaders, certain senior leaders, that we can't set challenging goals. We need to set goals that are very achievable for our teams because we want them to feel the success of goal achievement. Challenging goals are demotivating, is one of the statements that I hear often. And what we actually know from motivation science research is that setting the highest and most difficult goals produces the highest levels of effort and performance. So, again, these facts all presume a certain amount of healthy operating and healthy ecosystem in our organization around trust and safety. But what we see in research from Locke and Latham on goal setting is that setting high and difficult goals actually produces the highest levels of effort and performance. There's also a myth that's really common even in OKR circles that people have to write their own goals to be motivated by them. And again, Locke and Latham's research shows that participation in goal setting isn't required for motivation if adequate rationale is given. So, for teams or organizations that are struggling with thinking about the massiveness of properly, setting and localizing OKRs and having everyone be involved in the goal drafting, we can dial down that investment quite a bit by recognizing that according to the best available motivation science, if we prepare a strong rationale, if we communicate goals with a rationale as leaders, then that might bring our team along. Without them having to be involved in the drafting of the goals. They can be involved in the review of the goals and the communication about whether that rationale is adequate. And then the last one, this one I couldn't even sum down to a handful of specific examples, but I just hear objections around OKRs always, that they're inefficient, that they are confusing, that they are inconsistent within the organization, that they waste time to create, or we spend way too long creating them and not enough time working to achieve them. And that particular, I shouldn't even have shown that as orange as a myth because those things can be true. OKRs may be really poorly implemented. And so when we see those issues with how OKRs are implemented in an organization, or when we see those symptoms, that isn't necessarily that OKRs are all those things. It's that the implementation in the organization is letting our OKRs be those things or be those downsides. And so, what we work to do with organizations is to ensure that those downsides of OKRs aren't present, that we have operating practices, rhythms, shared words, and meanings that let us implement OKRs really simply, really efficiently, and for usefulness. So, our OKRs, our goals, they aren't just something that sits on a shelf. They are created for the purpose of being used to help us make change and do better. So, usefulness is a core principle. So, victory on change with changing our mindset around goals replaces fear with curiosity. Curiosity is an antidote to anxiety. And when we can create conditions in our stretch goals, in our OKRs, to be safe to try and even fail in the pursuit of learning and progress, we can be curious about what we find and how we're doing at every step of the way, replacing that fear of what's going to happen if we fail with it is safe to fail on these particular key results because they're in the territory where we know they're an experiment, they're set a stretch. We work to replace the idea of winning and losing with winning and learning. So we are never losing in our stretch goal territories, in our change or transformation territories. We are winning if we're on track or making progress. And if we're off track, then we're getting valuable learnings that we can learn from and figure out how to get back on track or shift our course or approach. And we are building resilience to take on hard challenges and celebrate progress. This isn't a switch that flips overnight. What we're talking about here is behavior that has to be modeled and reinforced by our leaders. We need to see our leaders taking these, risk steps into uncertain territory and then being intellectually humble about what they learn. So we model replacing spin or focusing on looking better with actually sharing with our organizations the truth of how we're doing and what we're learning from it and how we plan to improve going forward. We also, this is that mind shift slide that knowing who's on this call, knowing how many change makers we do have here, I wanted to give you a little nudge to rethink the role of the change maker because most of us become people who are working in change because we are professional problem solvers. We see the issues, we see the potential solutions, we see how things could change quite often. So we're the issue spotters, the solution seers, the answer havers, and we get really depended on for those skills. But what that does when we exercise those skills is it puts us in a position of persuading and trying to bring our organizations along with our vision, which is really important. And that is a very important role that change makers play. But the reason we're following that conversation about myths, within a minute, I'm going to share some key questions for uncovering change opportunity in your organization. Is that the muscle that we as change makers can build to be more effective is actually around asking questions, building a case for change based on data, not based on our opinion or what we see of the future or of what's possible, and then creating an opportunity for other people to come along on their own as collaboratively invested in the change that we saw possible. So, if you're a change maker who's really strongly wired for solutioning, for enunciating the problem and the solution, and then you experience what I hear about all the time in my coaching work with one on one clients is I just don't feel like people engaged with my idea, or I don't understand the resistance in my organization, or the feedback was really unsatisfying when I presented my vision of change. Then those are signals that we might work on our ability to question and collaboratively create the case for change with better data, with more participation from others, so that by the time we get to the room and we're walking in and we're sharing that case for change and the solution, the other people around the table are nodding their heads because they've been involved every step of the way and they feel invested instead of like, I'm coming in with these outside ideas that then, if they're fully baked, they're going to go right to critical mode instead of collaborative mode. So that's why we are going to look at some questions that you can use to unblock change in your organization. And one is just one of the grounding questions that we always use in goal setting work, especially in OKRs, which is what is ultimately most important to achieve. It's pretty fascinating how rarely we ask and answer that question for ourselves when we're just in the regular course of business, or when for ourselves or our organizations, when we're in the execution of our business. But it's an important check in, because if something isn't most important, doesn't mean we don't do it, but it leads to a second question of why are we invested in doing it? So, asking that question, refocusing ourselves on what is ultimately most important to achieve, points us to what may need to change. And what might need to change might be overwhelming, it might be scary, it might be not possible to implement in one bite. But when we have that recentering to ask ourselves what's ultimately most important to achieve, it reminds us of the change that we need to consider working toward. And it gives us a chance to check in on our other activities and consider, do we spend this much time, effort, and resources on these activities that don't fall into our most important bucket? Or how can we gain some efficiency around those business as usual or the activities that fall outside of our most important as an organization? Another great question, this one, there's kind of, this has become a bit of an activism point for me, that we can ask, where would we benefit from better objective progress data? So one of the dynamics I see over and over and over is that teams are estimating progress based on what percentage they feel they are complete with their work. In way too many cases, we're relying on subjective estimations of progress for keeping a pulse on our performance during the quarter or during the year. And then at the end of the quarter or the end of the year, we look at what was our actual outcome on that factor, and we might have missed the mark entirely. Um, in the practice, we call those watermelon metrics because they're green, green, green on the outside all quarter, and then red on the inside on the ultimate measure. or the ultimate outcome that that was designed to achieve. So when we're trying to unblock change, we can look at where are those watermelons in our business? Where are we at risk of watermeloning? Because when we are, we might be experiencing unnecessary risk or missing opportunities because we don't have that good progress data to rely on to examine how we're doing. And then we can also ask, where would we benefit from greater experimentation? This comes back to, where are we afraid to try because we're afraid to fail? So we can get deliberate about thinking about, where would we benefit from greater experimentation? Where do we need to put a special effort to know that we're safe to experiment and even fail in the pursuit of learning and learning how to do better in the future? And then another biggie is making the case for change on legacy or inefficient practices might require quantification. This is one of those places where, as change makers, we often spot the potential for things to be improved or done better. But we might make that case as an opinion or an observation where we can actually, create a KR for a quarter to baseline that measure around uh, how long we're spending on one of those problematic legacy practices or one of those inefficient practices that we know are a problem but have struggled to get the green light to actually improve. And so we can set a goal for a phase to baseline and improve on one of those measures. And then it might mean some kind of onerous data tracking to establish the baseline. But sometimes we can really strongly make the case for change by investing in getting data on how much time we're really spending. So we may quantify the problem so we can make a better educated decision and a stronger case about applying resources to fixing it. So those questions are my gift to you coming out of today. Tuck those away. Like I said, I'll share this with folks who were on this call. In addition, I have some other resources that I'm going to include. This is just like the big, huge view. So there's in the materials that I'll send are the materials we covered today. Also, a little intro to objectives and key results through the lens of the work that we do at Red Current Collective with evolutionary OKRs. So the specific approach that we take to OKRs, some of the benefits, where they fit into our strategic stack. So how objectives and key results can connect our strategic inputs or our durable strategic work to our execution by filling that really important gap that a lot of organizations skip right over, which is the conversation about how we're going to measure success and progress. And then I also include a couple of examples of what that completed stack looks like for an organization, as well as an example set of company level OKRs. And I know some of you are in really large organizations, so the specific example that I'm sharing is actually one of my older ones from Red Current Collective, because I can't share anything from clients. And whenever I try to create made up examples, they just fall flat. It's, I think, more important to see examples of how they're really used in an organization. So the specific words in that one apply more to a smaller organization than a large distributed organization. But the structure that is shown there with, a single page of showing our strategic inputs and then how those cascade down into most important health measures, how that translates into our objectives, all on one page. So we've got that as a resource for everyone to understand our strategic inputs on a page, not by reviewing a 50 or 150 page strategic deck. And then a second page that shows what company level OKRs can look like, again, on a single page. Because if you can't see it, it might not exist. If we don't see them every day, or if we don't see our OKRs regularly, um, There's actually data that says from a study out of Sears, even if we don't see our OKRs, we still see about a 3% increase in performance just by virtue of writing OKRs over not writing OKRs. But what we're all here to do is to get really big gains on our performance. And so we want to keep our OKRs, on a page and front and center. All right. So with that, that's the kind of knowledge transfer part of today. And I'd love to open it up now for questions. I saw one come through already. So I'm going to look in the chat window here and go back to questions. And I'll answer questions verbally. I can't reply while I'm talking through chat. So if I miss anything or miss anyone, I'll follow up after when I get a chance to see the chat transcript. But send questions through, and we'll get through as many as we can in the next few minutes. Corinne asked, how can we feel safe with change during this extreme volatility? The safe choice feels like hunkering down and status quo. That is such an important question, Corinne, because everyone here has very real realities around, personal getting through a down market. So being in a position to keep our bills paid and keep that health insurance and make sure that our kind of base of our Maslow's hierarchy is safe and sound. And so there may be less appetite for discretionary or visionary change right now. It might be the right choice to hunker down a bit. The place where my eye always goes in down markets like this is we don't always have to think about visionary change. We might put a pin in some of the higher risk visionary change that we see possible during a down market. And we might look at what are the ways that we can see incremental improvement, efficiency gains, anything that helps us use resources better. We're all doing more with less. And so for us as change makers, we can scratch that change itch by working to make things better wherever we are. And then kind of putting a pin in those visionary opportunities until the market conditions are more receptive for them. It's also one of the bits of work that I do with executive coaching clients is we can't always change jobs. We can't always change companies when we're in a poor fit or in a suboptimal position. And so what can we do to recognize, that change itch or that progress itch that we need to scratch? Those needs might not be met by our organization or our relationship with our organization. We might have to find other ways to scratch that itch for ourselves with our intrinsic motivation or our identification of what we can learn, even in a suboptimal environment. It I hate to kind of boil it down this much, but it lets us ask the question of what's our why, but what's our why right now, where we are, given the market that we're operating in. Feeling safe, though, I think it's hard. And this is a little bit of those like matrix, is it green pill, red pill things? I think a lot of folks um, have a sense of security in kind of status quo roles or in environments that feel safe, where they're kind of trying to keep the peace. Um, and what we too often find is that it is actually a thin veil of security. We may be kind of riding out the status quo and at very high risk of change that we just aren't aware is right around the corner. So that's another kind of personal responsibility point that we work with our clients around is to know that change is actually constant. The only constant is change. And so we might have times where we feel a bit safer, but we can also cultivate practices, foundations, and resilience in order to help ourselves find a sense of safety, even when we're in really volatile environments. So a few thoughts there. And it is, that shift from we might not all be in a position to go for the visionary right now, although there are plenty of places in the market where that is what's happening. But we might choose safer choices in a down market. And then remember, we can still scratch our change itch because there's always places that we can build that case for improvement. Or a lot of what my clients are doing right now is practicing these skills in their current environment because they're not attached to the outcome. These are when we hunker down, those are good chances to practice new ways of working, leading, and self managing. Because what do we have to lose? So, that great question. And then Corinne also shared baseline KRs. Yeah, vital for success. She says baseline KRs are my favorite. This is vital for success in young orgs, but also asks for introspection in established teams. Are we actually measuring what matters? It's so true. It's so true. And um, baselining remains important because if we can't measure something at one point, we might not. And then we might find that not measuring that is actually continuing to create risk in our business. So we have a lot of tricks around creative ways to think about how to quantify or measure those parts of the business that we think we can't measure. And I discourage teams from writing a whole set of OKRs that are based on setting baselines. But we do have those really important places where we have to baseline. We have to see what is our current state. And that becomes really important for change because we have to make that case for change. There is a really excellent book. I'm looking this way because it's on my bookshelf that's over here called How to Measure Anything. It was published by Wiley, How to Measure Anything, and the author's last name is Hubbard. And that is it's a great resource if you're in a hard to measure part of the business. I've got a bunch of tricks for helping teams think creatively about measurement. Folks who join us for the No BS OKRs the second week of December learn those tricks in that 1 week class. But if you want to read How to Measure Anything is a great read for creative ways to measure also. All right, team. Well, we're getting close to time, and I don't see other questions coming through. So I'll just cover a couple quick more thoughts, and then I'll let you go to enjoy the rest of your Thursday. There are, as I said, a number of resources, kind of basics about OKRs and the way that we approach OKRs in the materials that I'll share or make available after this. Some benefits, both to organizations, but also to individuals. We always think about OKRs in the organizational context, but we work with applying some of the same principles to individual goal setting and envisioning our futures because there are benefits to individuals as well. There's also a couple of resources that show how we put OKRs into context in organizations. So instead of creating OKRs as this separate rhythm that gets bolted on, which a lot of times people do because of the lack of great practical implementation advice available. Um, we actually, treat OKRs as more of a part of a cohesive planning stack that connects strategy through to execution. So I've included a couple of resources about that, also some words and meanings around OKRs, and the example OKRs that I mentioned. So We do have an opportunity for those of you who were on the call today. I'm offering a $100 discount for the No BS OKRs course that we're doing the second week of December. Starts on December 12th with the first live session on the 13th. It's a 1 week class where you can join. We're going to really focus on change with this particular cohort, kind of getting ready for the new year. And what we do in that class is we go from a blank page on Monday to finished OKRs by Friday. That course is an incredible bargain. I give you my entire playbook on OKR creation, and the course without the discount is about 10% of the cost of what organizations are charged to get a copy of that playbook. So it's a really high value session. We had a great cohort in November that completed, everyone completed OKRs during the week. All participants walked out with completed OKRs during the week. And so it's a little bit of in class time for workshop. There is a little bit of outside of class time as well, but you start the week with a blank page and you end the week with your OKRs on a page. So there's a coupon code there on the screen. I'll share all this with you in case anyone does want to join. And I just want to say thank you all so much for tuning in. It's been great to kind of get on live. I struggle with perfectionism, so recording video is my kryptonite. I do it all the time and I never share any of it. So thank you all for being part of trying to challenge my perfectionism by trusting the universe and going live. It's been really fun, and I look forward to the questions that this prompts afterward. So y'all have my contact info now. You know where to find me, how to reach me, and I'll reach out with those resources I mentioned and a copy of what we covered today. So thanks so much, team. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Bye-bye.